but we were very keen to have somebody from the Arts and Humanities Research Institute to present a seminar. For those of you who don't know, what we've been trying to do at the university is put together a little cluster of everybody who's working on conflict-related issues. So we've been putting together institutes like Arts and Humanities, Social Science, Transitional Justice, INCORE. So this was our first time we've run the series. So we're glad that Arts and Humanities are part of that. So I just want to welcome Lisa, and I'll let you introduce yourself and do the rest. But I just want to say a tiny bit about IPAC, and there's a web page on INCORE site if there's anything.
My area is drama. I lecture in drama here at the McGee campus, and my research is concerned at the moment with representations of sexual and domestic violence in Northern Irish theatre, in Northern Ireland, in the public forum of the theatre, during the Troubles and following the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. And it tries to chart a dialogic relationship, and I'm going to trace that out in broad strokes here today, between the theatre and the host society. So my work is mostly focused on theatre and drama, and what I'm going to do is, I decided in the seminar, since I know most people are not from that background, perhaps nobody is from that background, it might be useful to talk about some of the texts that I'm looking at and some of the ways of interpreting those texts. So some key influences for me in the work which addresses the issue of performance of violence on stage. Simone Weil's essay on the Iliad, where she writes that force is that which makes a thing of whoever submits to it. Most obviously in making a corpse of a human being, and less obviously by reducing a human being to a thing. She says, from the power to change a human being into a thing by making him die, there comes another power in its way more momentous, that of making a still living human being into a thing. He is living, he has a soul, he is nonetheless a thing. Secondly, from Slavoj Žižek, what I find useful is his definitions of objective and subjective violence. Dramatic representation often seems to be concerned with subjective violence, that is, with violence done to a protagonist by an antagonist, with violent acts that move the plot along to its conclusion. And in contrast, the operation of objective violence is invisible. So Žižek defines subjective and objective violence, and he splits subjective violence into both the symbolic and the systemic. And the symbolic he describes as being embodied in language, that it involves the imposition of a universe of meaning. And the systemic violence operates invisibly, but he says it is often the catastrophic consequences of the smooth functioning of our political and economic systems. So I would suggest that sexual violence of all kinds is systemic, for although individual acts are interpersonal and subjective, overall sexual violence operates to enforce normative concepts of gender and sexuality. So there are very many various representations of sexual and domestic violence in the work of Northern Irish playwrights and theatre companies, and I'm just going to talk about three examples, one that dates from 1993 and two that are post-1998, post-Good Friday Agreement. One from 2005 and one from 2006. So to argue the significance of fictional representations of violence, I'd like to start by situating theatre in its social context. And this research progresses from the assumption that theatrical representations are engaged in a dialogic relationship with the actual world. So in this instance, as well, I'm concerned with performances of gender and gender relationships in the social world, and the ways in which the political and civil conflict in Northern Ireland has inflected local, everyday performances of gender identity, influencing attitudes to interpersonal violence, and in particular violence against women. And drawing upon the definition of performance offered by Richard Schechner as an inclusive term incorporating a wide range of human activity, and that's Schechner's definition there. I'm defining it in this context as performances of everyday life that demarcate socially acceptable gender behaviour, and in doing so reiterate and reinscribe gender norms or challenge them to demonstrate new ways of being in the social world. The model of performance and textual analysis that I use mainly is socio-semiotic approach, which recognises the influence of material details of the surrounding culture and society on both the staging of the work and on its reception, and the ideological assumptions underlying social practice. So scholars like Monica McWilliams, Susan McKay, Eileen Everson, Christina Loughran, writing during the 1980s and 1990s, and some of their journalism for Fortnight magazine, comment on common social practices and attitudes relating to violence against women and to conventions of gender-appropriate behaviour. Many of these authors also published full-length academic studies as well, of course, exploring the status of women. And their findings are reflected in the dramatic representation of domestic life in Northern Ireland in plays by female dramatists like Christina Reid and Anne Devlin in particular. So the plays read together with the articles in Fortnight invoke a deeply conservative society, where sin and sex are closely intertwined, where female sexuality is anxiously policed and ideally contained within the family. And the family, which repeatedly appears in Northern Irish theatre as a metaphor for the state, although that's by no means extraordinary to Northern Ireland, is situated firmly as a patriarchal unit in both the fictional and actual worlds, with father at its head and his position confirmed by local religious practice as well as political rhetoric and popular constructions of gender. So the performance of male dominance and female subordination in the social world is evident in a whole range of areas, really, that the work of McWilliams and others addresses. And it includes the exclusion of women from, or near exclusion of women from party politics until recent years, the exclusion of women from influential organisations like the Orange Order, the marginalisation of women in the Royal Constabulary as it was then, and they weren't armed until 1993. And I just wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time considering that, because I think it's such an interesting performance of gender in itself, the unarmed female police officer paired with the armed male police officer. What it communicates immediately and in a very visible way is this sort of contradiction of gendered behaviour. So if we understand that helplessness is a desirable feminine quality, then we have the female officer on the streets, unarmed, and therefore designated as helpless, attached to her armed partner, and therefore under the protection and governance of him. The implications seem to be that women are not tough enough to work with deadly weapons, or that their natures inhibit their full engagement with their professional opportunities. But at the same time, the policy made women helpless, so they are rendered helpless, and then this helplessness becomes sort of reiterated and reinforced. In this sort of deeply patriarchal culture, it's unsurprising, I think, that considerable suspicion was directed at services like counselling services for victims of rape and domestic violence. And McWilliams again comments, when cultural values subscribe to keeping the family together, that there are sanctions for those who take a different approach, who attempt to offer a different kind of sanctuary. Also coming through in the writings of women like McWilliams and McKay, the phrase "an armed patriarchy" is used repeatedly. It's a very vivid phrase, I think, as a description of Northern Irish society. And both Everson and McWilliams write of the marginalisation of gender-based violence by the state, and they document its treatment as a minor problem in comparison to paramilitary violence, so ignoring a well-documented relationship between public and private forms of violence. Other significant issues in this marginalisation include the reluctance of women in some communities to pass information to the police, reluctance for various reasons to engage with paramilitary policing, sensationalist media coverage of rape cases, which was often sympathetic to the accused. And post-conflict, recent surveys by Amnesty suggest that these cultural attitudes persist in a greater tolerance to sexual violence and violence against women than in other parts of the United Kingdom or Ireland. So this was a headline from 2008 that more than 40% of Northern Irish students believe that a woman was partially or totally responsible for being raped if she flirted with someone. One of the things that's kind of interesting, I think, when you go back to the literature is the way in which rape is used repeatedly as a metaphor. And so Collier talks about context as being a text, the significance of the context to the work, and that context is inseparable, really, from the artistic text. Because in the artistic text, the signs, the methods of communication are framed by the discourses that are current in the society and by the meanings that are in circulation there. So in the instance of Northern Ireland, and in the theatre in Northern Ireland, the reception of the work is shaped by a complex set of political and cultural and social circumstances and attitudes to gender and gender behaviour and interpersonal violence. And all of this is shaped and intensified by the decades of civic violence. So the cultural circumstances in turn are then also shaped, they're in an intertextual relationship with foundational stories of the colonial conflict and stories in which women and land are elided and gender violence becomes part of a narrative about national identity or about self-determination. So rape has been used as a metaphor for invasion and conquest and for colonization for hundreds of years. It's used both in imperial texts and anti-imperial texts. And so this is from Luke Gernon's 16th century essay and his description of Ireland, which imaginatively equates military and sexual conquest. So Ireland is depicted as ripe for this rape or seduction, described clearly in very feminine terms that suggest fertility and youth and sexual desire. The first step is the invasion, the second step, a constant relationship that's expressed in terms of sexual union. And that follows on from that. So colonization becomes naturalized or becomes understood as a sexual and familial relationship. And in parallel to this, then sexual violence becomes normalized as a kind of seduction. So that the interpersonal violence becomes sort of invisible into this, or subsumed into this metaphor. So one of the texts that I was looking at was Bill Morrison's A Love Song for Ulster, because it draws very much on this trope. It was commissioned by Tricycle Theatre in 1993 and performed in London. And it's a trilogy of plays which lasts 6 hours in performance. It wasn't very well received on its first outing, and I think it's very much a text that tries to communicate Northern Ireland to a non-Northern Ireland audience, so it very much has that sense about it. And it hasn't been produced in Northern Ireland. But what I think is interesting about it is the way that it uses sexual violence to talk about the conflict in the North. So the trilogy is about Kate and her husband John, who's murdered, and Victor, his brother, who becomes her second husband. And it uses the family to express this claustrophobic, intimate nature of the Northern Ireland conflict. So it visualises, the first play in the trilogy is called The Marriage, and that visualises the 1922 partition as the splitting of a family with Catholic Mary and her son Gabriel pushed across the border into the Free State, and her daughter Kate left behind in Northern Ireland to be forced into an arranged marriage with a Protestant farmer named John. Not long after the marriage, John is killed by Kate's brother Gabriel, and Victor finds Kate standing over John's dead body and guesses correctly that she knows who the murderer is. So the play contains 2 rape scenes, and they're both used as symbolic representations of the oppressive and violent cohabitation of the nationalist and loyalist communities. The first of them consummates the marriage of Kate to John, and the second is the rape of Kate by Victor over John's body. So this rape marks Victor's appropriation of his brother's estate, of which Kate is part, so that she becomes one of the objects to be claimed. And the play examines the systemic nature of sectarian violence, and its intrusion into the private domestic space of the family expresses the oppressive and violent cohabitation of these dominant communities. So the framing of the scenes then position the act of rape as a metaphor rather than a naturalistic depiction of interpersonal violence. And so it maintains the audience's focus on the violence and the abuse of power as characteristic of inter-community relationships, rather than as relevant to internet relationships. In imperial writings on Ireland, like those of Kernan, the representation of colonisation as a sexual or marital union allows the imperial text to activate, when you're reading it, when you're watching it on the stage, a range of meanings about gender and gender relationships, so that you bring these assumptions with you, of course, into the space of the theatre. And these meanings can normalise or neutralise the sense of the colonisation process. Sharkey argues the gendered anatomization of the land as female figure and the accompanying elision of women facilitated the easy displacement of possible culpability. The horror of rape and of colonial violence are thus both denied in these metaphorical shifts and displacements. And so similarly, the rapes in the marriage become something else, something other than bodily violence, and Kate's body signifies ambivalently in the process. So the first rape takes place on the wedding night. It follows a dialogue between John and Kate in which her contribution to the household is discussed by John, but although he sees a possibility of peaceful cohabitation between them, that possibility is very much based on the idea of her submission. So he tells her towards the end of the scene, "Honour and obey, those are the words." And she continues to argue with him and refuses to accompany him to bed, and the rape is then performed on the stage. In view of the audience, is described in this way in the stage directions. So, there's no indication in the text of the duration of this scene, which is a very sad one and seems to attempt to express despair, really, rather than desire. It's unusual in contemporary British or Irish theatre to have such an explicit representation of sexual violence. And the impediments to it include issues like the exposure of the body, which happens in a naturalistic representation, usually of the female body, and one of the issues then for playwright and for director is the problem of potentially offsetting the violence of the action with the visual pleasure of the spectacle. But Morrison's stage directions really specify positions of the actors so that we can see in this that Kate's body is not exposed. So this keeps the focus, I think, more on the violence of the action. And instead we have the blood on John's hand and on his face, Kate's uncomfortable position, John's cry on orgasm. And the blood, of course, signifies pain, but also the mingling of the blood that consummates the marriage, makes them one. And the act of generation. And by the end of the play, Kate is pregnant, although the identity of the father is not clear, whether it's this first husband or the second husband, his brother John, or his brother Victor. And that's deliberately ambiguous. So the emphasis on generation, though, which we see here in the symbol of the blood, is carried into the second rape of Kate by Victor over the body of her dead husband, and those are the stage directions for that. One of the curious things about the stage directions, because of course it's unperformable, is this, in brackets, not an act of sodomy, which is of course outside of pornography impossible to perform. I mean, the audience in the theatre see the kind of overall movements of the actors' bodies, but don't have that kind of access to that sort of detail. So it's only the reader who sees that, but it seems to be important enough to a playwright to specify it. And it seems to be there to imply, or to make clear that Kate's child could be the child of either man. So the metaphor of marriage in certain ways effectively represents this forcible union of two opposing communities in a small space of Northern Ireland. And does so, I think, rather clunkily. I mean, it's not the most finely tuned of scenes, I think. But it does so through a reliance on and a performance of normative gender roles and a model of marriage that is repressive. The play therefore offers a dramatic representation of the Northern Ireland Troubles that uses a metaphor that subordinates or even erases the experience of half of the population, because Kate represents not women but the nationalist community. And by assigning a gendered character to represent each community, the play obscures the gendered experience of the Troubles. As a symbol of one community's subordination to the other, Kate and John perform the injustice and oppression endemic in sectarian society, but they do so by performing the accepted roles of husband and wife respectively. So the injustice is not to Kate as a woman, but to Kate as a sign for the male nationalist population. And through the adoption of rape as an allegory for colonisation or political oppression, I would suggest it becomes essentially something else, something other than bodily, gendered, physical violence, because the violated body is at least obscured by this process. Feminist scholars have argued that literary representations of rape need to be reread to reinstate its violent and traumatic nature, and to reposition the usually normatively female victims as subjects and agents, rather than passive objects in a power struggle between male protagonists. So in her 1991 study, Reading Rembrandt, Mika Ball proposes a method she calls hysterical poetics, to reread or reinstate these gaps or lacunae that mark the absent voice of the female victim. The marriage, by opting to stage both rapes that Kate endures, on one level of course makes rape visible and present, and I will be talking about another play in which the rape is recounted in dialogue but is never visible, it's never shown to us. But the stage directions, I think, and the dialogue operate at another level to obscure the act of violence and to naturalise it. So firstly, the rape in this instance is the forceful consummation of the marriage. And as the play goes on, Kate complains to the priest, who tells her that she has nothing to complain about. She complains to her mother, who likewise dismisses her distress. And we have as well her kind of growing affection for her husband. So if rape is defined by the absence of consent, then by marrying John, Kate is understood to have already given her consent. So this principle that marriage vows constitute a perpetual and irrevocable consent to sexual intercourse was enshrined in law, of course, until the 1980s. John's violence thus becomes a reluctant enforcement of Kate's duty, while her gradual affection for her husband erases the violence of the scene or minimises it. And her initial resistance and pain and blood can be normalised within discourses of virgin modesty and the act of declaration. So the act exists in the dialogue as part of a process of gender and sectarian domination and blurs distinctions between Kate, all women, the Catholic community. The second rape by Victor is more clearly framed as an act of personal violence and revenge, but its operation as a metaphor again limits its impact as an act of interpersonal violence. So, what Ball does in her concept of hysterical poetics is she recommends reading for image rather than plot, and for detail rather than the main line, so that the imagery, however awkwardly realised, of the rape scenes seems to signify something different from how it signifies within the plot itself. We have Kate hanging awkwardly, painfully over the side of the table, being forcibly stripped and moved around the stage like an object, like a thing, to use Ball's words. The image of rape by Victor, literally over John's murdered body, signifies on the level of plot, as an act of conquest, or Victor's claiming of his brother's estate, and also as a violent reassertion of normative gender relationships and patriarchal continuity. But at the level of the image, it has the potential to recall images of war crimes, of historic and contemporary massacres. It suggests narratives that have emerged since the 1990s from Balkans, from Darfur, Rwanda, and Congo. And while within the plot it's an act of generation, as an image it suggests annihilation. So another use of domestic violence in Northern Irish theatre plays like the Family Plot by Dara Carwell, and that's 2005. It's a comedy, but it covers some similar ground. In comparison to Morrison's work, it's quite short. It's about a little more than an hour. But like Morrison, it depoliticizes gender relationships by using the family in this way as a metaphor for a state which is now in a process of reconciliation. So it transforms the violent relationship between Frank and his wife Tess into a farcical comedy set in the grave, where 3 generations of the family try to resolve their differences so they can move on to some unspecified afterlife. And the play premiered in Belfast at the festival and subsequently toured across Northern Ireland. It was described as darkly comic and mischievous by local critics, although The Guardian describes it as being dead on arrival, so again quite a mixed reception to the work. And the play opens with Frank, his wife Tess, and Frank's parents already in the grave, and this is the set design, the depiction of the grave as a sort of dark green area, with the characters dressed with their in sort of pajamas, with their faces smeared with soot and their hair back home. At the end of Act 1, they're joined by Frank's daughter Emer, who has committed suicide. So the whole family are there contained in the plot, in the family plot, and one by one they decide to move forward with some act of forgiveness or reconciliation. So the script is written to reproduce a Belfast accent. It uses colloquialisms that are familiar from regional comedy shows like Give My Head Peace or The Hole in the Wall Gang. And in performance, this rapid-fire dialogue discourages the audience from really taking more seriously the darker moments and encourages them instead to laugh. So, at least in that premiere production, those dark moments passed unnoticed. The grim grandfather's repeated exhortation to Frank to keep that woman he was under a bit of control is intercut then with Emer's memories of her mother standing in the kitchen crying, her hand to her face to her eye, my father raging, falling in drunk, Granda Kerr stirring it up, and then Tess, the mother's one interjection, spitting blood in a Belfast sink. So there's material within the play for an exploration of this culture of violence and misogyny that underlies the drunken, controlling behaviour of Frank and his father. And for the relationships between the stresses of civil violence and violence in the home to be foregrounded. But the play sidesteps these issues instead to offer a comedy based on cliches of forgiveness. The violence and its physical consequences of bruises and blood is not visually represented as it is in a marriage. And so it's more easily dismissed. And the political metaphor, which is overtly presented, meanwhile, I think limits engagement with the characters as individuals. They're stock characters who stand for a group identity. The play's focus on the subjective violence suffered by the character in the play, the wife character, again obscures the operation of power and force in gender roles of behaviour. So the subjective violence operates to obscure this sort of systemic violence which underlies it. One of the things that the play does, I think, is it exposes some of the difficulties of adopting the dramatic trope of the family in a new post-conflict situation. And in doing so, perhaps reflects a shift that's slowly becoming evident in social attitudes to gender and violence. As the civil conflict recedes in memory, as well as action, interpersonal forms of violence take on greater urgency and are rewarded more media coverage and political attention. Although the metaphor of the family does function as a representation of the intimate interrelationships of the two main communities in Northern Ireland, such a depiction requires the diffusing of state violence as an element in the conflict and papers over some of the real difficulties facing the peace process and erases not only the impact of gender on an individual's experiences of the troubles, but also the experiences of Northern Ireland's various immigrant communities, some of them of long standing. There are two more radical explorations of gender and violence on stage. I just want to very quickly mention the 1992 production Threshold by Derry Frontline, which is interesting for its attempt to make systemic violence visible. And for its proposal of a radical re-evaluation of gender relations alongside a radical interrogation of the functioning of power and authority and control by the state, and that's pre-ceasefire. And the last play that I'm going to talk about is Pump Girl. It's by Abby Spaulding. And as a very broad generalization, I'd suggest that the work of women playwrights is less concerned with using interpersonal relationships to represent civil conflict and more concerned with representing the ways in which the civil conflict have affected interpersonal relationships and familial relationships. And I think that's apparent in the work of Christina Reid, Anne Devlin and Sharbank Theatre Company in particular. The post-conflict work by a younger generation of women playwrights is largely unconcerned with sectarian identity, but still represents female characters whose lives are bound about by the material consequences of being female in a particular society at a particular time. But what has changed about it is that the misogyny that the characters experience and that they represent, as represented on the stage, and now sometimes confront, is rooted in contemporary popular culture as well as, or sometimes instead of, traditional practices. So Pump Girl premiered in 2006 at the Edinburgh Festival and was first produced in Belfast 2 years later, where it attracted some notoriety before it opened, being described as a sensational play. In fact, that's an unfounded sort of accusation. It's very much unsensational. It's constructed from monologues by 3 characters. There is Pump Girl, a plain girl who works in a petrol station. There's her married lover, Hammy, who works in a chicken farm, and Hammy's wife, Sinead. And there are various other unseen characters who are described in the monologues. The play is set on the border near Newry, and the area is communicated to us by references to local landmarks. There's only one reference to the conflict, and that's when Pump Girl says that she and Hammy have sex in a deserted area where, quote, 2 prods were took and killed about 15 years ago. Their families have struck wreaths and things onto the trees. It looks well. And the grim comedy, really, in the lines isn't deliberate to the character, taken with other snippets of description. It paints a picture of this material and intellectual and spiritual impoverishment. The language is casually misogynistic. Pump Girl calls Hammy's wife the cunt and is in turn called the cunt by him and sometimes addressed by him as cunt. So their romantic trysts beside the hatcheries, the burned out library van and the memorial are meaningful to her, even though they paint a vivid picture of contemporary culture where the conflict is over but the scars remain in the form of grief, poverty, and lack of aspiration. So it's, I think, significant that it's a library van that's burned out. And at the end of Act 1, Hammy and his friends McCabe and McManus take Pump Girl out in the car, get her very drunk so that she's almost unconscious, and rape her. And she describes the rape in a monologue spoken in the present tense, with hers as the only testimony. She's unable to name it as rape within the play, and she's confused about what has happened. And the way that the work functions is it gives us access to the character's interiority, to their interior thoughts, as well as to what happened to them. And this foregrounds the horror of the attack. So this confusing, chaotic nature of violence, which is very difficult to perform on the stage, is given expression in language instead. And particularly, we have these images of panic, of struggle and terror that isn't performed, but is communicated through the image of the drowning, trapped passengers in the sinking car. And the 4 people scratching on the roof. So Monica McWilliams writes of societies that are emerging from a conflict that it's important for both sexes to consider what elements of the culture to preserve and what to discard, and identifies the need for Northern Ireland to recognise and address the infiltration of the private world by public violence. In Northern Ireland, the situation is mixed, but there are positive, I think, indications of society moving towards greater opportunities for women. There are key developments like the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, which forced issues affecting women into the public forum, asserted the right of women to be represented, and attempted to move politics beyond the single constitutional issue and instead to address issues relevant to the everyday lives of ordinary people. And there again, I mean, I would suggest that the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition can be understood again as performance, that you have in the public space, this time of the political arena, the visibility of women, which makes us kind of shifts certain understandings and makes possible another way of being a woman in Northern Ireland. So there's some mixed success of the transitional justice system, which was recently critiqued by Catherine O'Rourke for its failure to develop a gendered model, arguing that the model used failed to address social and personal difficulties for women in reporting sexual violence. And O'Rourke notes that the, quote, resistance of prevailing traditional justice frameworks to the feminist-informed definition of harm to look beyond the narrow focus on so-called public or political violence. And she notes that transitional justice process in Northern Ireland, a cornerstone of the creation of a new society, is said to focus unduly on the state and reasserting the state's authority at exactly the point in which the state's capacity and legitimacy is severely limited. But proposals to substitute the community for the state, quote, proceeds with little recognition of women's relative absence from positions of leadership in either form. One of the critiques really, I think, or would suggest at the moment, is that rather than creating a radical change that was promised as following a satisfactory resolution of the conflict, the main political parties have been concerned with securing peace rather than risking fresh conflict through a radical reappraisal of social and cultural practices. So we have a kind of continuing situation where the family, the cornerstone of society, adherence to traditional religious beliefs remains high, and this is reflected in policies and statements of the main parties, particularly in relation to gender and to the status of women. So a performance that explores Northern Ireland's troubled history and transition to a post-conflict society is less necessarily still in its infancy. But some productions and texts, I think, do attempt to explore the systemic nature of gendered violence and its intrusion into public and private life, and the impact of this on the status and material circumstances of women as a group in post-ceasefire Northern Ireland. Thank you. So that's kind of a rush through some of my current research on this, and I'd be very interested in any questions that you have.
I'm really got a question, but a comment would be on that, the thing on plays, you know, that have shown domestic violence and have, I saw Martin Lynch one once, there was domestic violence, and there was, you know, he goes for comedy, and he had the stage was divided in two, and there was men cracking with drink and all, and at the end of the play, the woman on the other side, she hung herself, and the audience laughed because he didn't get it right, you know, he had it, you know, focused on the funny things, you know, so he hadn't managed to get the balance right of how serious it was, you know, or domestic violence was. And so often that's what happens in plays that are local kind of comedy ones, you know, hitting somebody or violence or calling somebody a cunt or something, you know, it's just part of the joke and the laughter, you know. So it's very connected, I think, and very, you know, helps people disconnect from the seriousness of violence against women.
Yeah, well, I think staging violence is tricky for all the reasons that you point out. I mean, you have the audience's expectation as well when we go to a Martin Lynch play. He's a Belfast playwright, and he writes very popular work. And I think that they expect a kind of a good night out. So they go with that already as their expectation. And then it is very much, I think, too, in the pacing of the work. So what I found when I saw Family Plot was that the play moved so fast, and it used so many familiar kind of stock figures from Give My Head Peace or from those other popular comedy shows that anyone who was any kind of local audience were sort of bound to laugh at it because it played into all their expectations of you know, the audience's expectations. And I went to see it with somebody else who's not from Northern Ireland, and we were taken aback. But then it's true that we didn't know the references at that stage. You know, we weren't familiar with the source material that he was drawing on. So I think you know that there is that issue of what the audience bring with them into the theatre, and that's really
And the balance, that the author doesn't get the balance right. He goes
Yeah.
to both of the comedy, whereas Charlemagne managed to work well with it. Charlemagne plays, you know, to me, a classic in working with the violent stories and then the fun, and being able to move from one to the other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Charlemagne's work is very, sort of creative, of course, by a group of women and very much with a sort of female, I think, set of priorities in mind.
I also think, and we were talking about name, you know, we call Derry's calls a maiden city, you know, and that's just a rape, you know, it hasn't been raped, it wasn't taken.
Yeah.
And, you know, people don't see that why I get enraged about that as a rape metaphor. People don't see it. They just say, well, you know, maiden city is another way of avoiding saying Derry or Londonderry, you know, and, you know, it's a third thing that really drives me mad about, you know, the maiden city is that, you know, Maiden City Festival and all, you know, based on the female, you know, thing of rape,
Yeah.
non-rape, so rape.
Yeah. Very much so, yeah.
So it's very strong.
I thought your illustration of the unarmed female REC officer, when did you say they were on
1993, I mean, I just didn't come across that sort of information.
It's quite an interesting illustration, I mean, in terms of sort of also sort of normalized contemporary concepts and thinking, but if you know, it's also, you know, sometimes where powerlessness and power are close together, because if you're looking at it from a particularly non-violent point of view, you would say that that woman potentially, okay, she's in a very subordinate position, but is freed from not having a gun to act in ways which the man holding the gun, you know, wouldn't even dream of. So, you know, even in that example, which is totally in the patriarchal context, there is the potential for it to be turned around into a different metaphor, into a different way of relating to people and to violence or to society.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it depends on how much agency you have then as the unarmed police officer. The descriptions in Christine Taylor who writes about it, I think, of them attached to the male officer by the, I don't know, Brandon, do you know what it is? There's some aspect of the equipment which attached the male and the female officer to each other, sort of physically, like a kind of a lead, like she described it. So I think if you have, you know, two people who are not, one of whom is not armed outright, it does give scope. I think it's noticeable though that it was the women who were not armed and who were not allowed to be armed. So you know, all sorts of aspects of agency then are kind of removed. You know, I think it's readable in a number of different ways. But I think it has there's a sort of material set of circumstances as well that you know, about who is being controlled, who's trusted with a weapon and who's not.
It's very much violent, you know, having weapons is power, you know, so, you know, the male is seen as a power, so, you know, women joining in on that, you know, as I would go abroad, you know, in the non-violence or the feminist viewpoint, you know, you don't want to be part of that, you know, you don't want to have women armed as well, you know, as you said, there's other ways of doing it, you know. And so when women came out in non-violent ways, the state looked at how they could manipulate that, you know, for their purposes of power.
Yeah.
Power over people. There's other ways, you know, there's other, as well as that violence that's portrayed and represented as women and this country and all that too, which is horrific. There's other ways too. If you don't have guns and probably you have another kind of power, then how can that be manipulated in the struggle, you know, to dominate?
Yeah.
Comment as well. I find it really interesting that you noticed that because I'm not from here, and so please excuse my ignorance. But you mentioned that female playwrights tend to write more and focus more on the interpersonal relationships after, post the conflict, whereas male playwrights tend to focus on the interpersonal. I forgot how you phrased it, but that was a really interesting kind of parallel insight you had, and I thought, could you elaborate more, maybe explain a bit more? Do you think that that really kind of shapes the way that these plays are written and demonstrates and continue to kind of reinforce the gender?
Yeah, I think, it's a gross generalization on my part. It's quite a sexist statement, really. But from the reading that I've done, what seems to me to be the case is that the family is very often used as a metaphor for the violence in the work of a lot of male playwrights who are addressing that specific issue. Whereas a lot of the female playwrights who are addressing that issue sort of flip it over. So their focus is on the family, and then the family, but the effect of the violence on the family is their focus. So it's sort of the same, it's sort of a different prioritizing.
Different level of effect, where from the male playwrights, they would be more focused on the relationships, a lower level between the female and male characters, and whereas females, how the effects of, the violence is are you saying that it's...
I guess, if I use the marriages that was one I was talking about as an example, so we have the play is apparently about a family. On one level it's about a family history, but actually the family is really about Northern Ireland. It's really, they stand for the two communities, they represent the two communities. Whereas there's a play called Tea in a China Cup, which is written in 1983 by Christina Reid, and she again talks about the family through a number of generations, like the marriage, but in her case she uses sort of public events. She uses the 12th of July as a kind of spine for the play. So for each of the different generations, it's the 12th of July. It's around the 12th of July celebrations. But her focus is very much on those relationships, on the relationships between the mother and her daughter and the daughter's close female friends. So instead, the characters, rather than representing something outside of themselves, the main focus is on this kind of network of interpersonal relationships, not standing for something else, at least not in the same sort of metaphoric way. And what her play looks at is this, the ways in which each generation of the women are inculcated into this particular set of kind of social and cultural beliefs, that they're part of a loyalist community, that they're subordinate to the men in the community. So the mother is sort of the less loved child in her family compared to her brother. Her daughter, then she marries someone who drinks a lot and gambles and is unkind, but she has to tolerate that, and she brings her daughter up to sort of tolerate the same kind of repressive circumstances. I think what the playwright does is the outside circumstances become significant to the characters, whereas with Morrison, the characters stand for the outside circumstances. I don't know if that. I don't know. I mean, I'm not. I think that probably feeds in still to some of the post-ceasefire work. Like I think that the family plot is about the metaphor of the family again for the society, whereas Pump Girl is again uses these characters to expose something about the society.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I really have a question in the direct sense of the word, but I was really interested in the discussion around colonialism as a metaphor for gender violence. And I suppose what I was thinking is, how does that apply in a context where colonialism is also changing and it's sort of in modernizing in inverted commas? And so I was sort of thinking about, does that parallel to how society deals with gender violence, through more structures and bureaucracy and other sorts of things? So I don't know if it's a question or just an observation or just to hear your thoughts about it. So sort of thinking about the juxtaposition between, I suppose, the examples you give there, which are sort of very blatant, obvious forms of colonialism and imperialism, but actually now colonialism has become a much more sophisticated exchange, and so we're sort of interested if that then mirrors to gender violence as a more sophisticated way in which we systematically ignore it or hide it or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's, of course, Gernon is absolutely blatant, and I think even relatively recent models of decolonization sometimes reference, I'm thinking of people like Fanon and Said, reference the ways in which they would argue that the colonized are kind of figured as female, and the impact of that then sort of psychologically or psychoanalytically within the society as it decolonizes. But I think if I think of some very contemporary examples of colonization or of colonization of resource in particular, I think there are ways in which the old discourse still feeds in, although in a much less kind of explicit or crude way. But I think, in terms of the pursuit of oil as a resource, for example, I think that there's a sort of something underlying in the discourse about who has the capacity to control resource, who knows best. So I think I think Eurocentric is probably not the right word, but there is, because the power base is not necessarily so clearly European, but I think there is nonetheless kind of an operation of who knows who's able to do it, who's not. And one of the things, I suppose this isn't to jump somewhat, is that one of the things that I've noticed is that the status of women or the treatment of women, violence against women are often presented to us as reasons for doing things. So the Taliban's treatment of women in particular. And yet that's only significant when there is something else at stake. So women become a pretext or part of the discourse of how bad this other society is and how we need to intervene there. But the same attention, of course, isn't paid to the treatment of women in Saudi as the treatment of women in Afghanistan. And so I think women very much become a kind of tool as well for explaining, or a sort of shorthand for explaining how bad a country is, that they do this to the women. But if there are allies, it doesn't matter. And I think that there's a real issue there around human rights and gender, and the ways in which our sense of whose rights are important are inflected by gender. And I don't mean in a, not even necessarily in a very deliberate, old-fashioned sexist way, but just that we carry the traces of that, I think, with us.
I think that's a very good example in relation to Afghanistan, because I think the whole gender thing was used as a reason for intervening, but it's not used as a way of judging whether intervention has been successful.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, it's like it's very blatant when the West is intervening somewhere like that, judging success in relation to gender issues. forget it. I mean, okay, there are people obviously who raise that issue, but it's not. It gets lost in the shuffle and just disappears somewhere.
Well, it gets used though as a reason to stay. It does come up with, if we leave now, things will go back to the way they were and women will be worse off, they'll be punished. And so it's used as, for those who want to stay even longer, as a reason that we need to stay on and that the mission isn't complete. Whatever that mission wants to be in.
Just a continuation of that comment, like, I think in using women, like you said, probably, I know this is really maybe sexism and stuff, but women are seen probably more vulnerable, so like you said, like, it gives people more, like, maybe the Afghanistan reason for people to intervene and help these helpless women or whatever, and things like that, and they're more subject to the violence, like, in news and things like that. Increasing numbers of, like, information is shown about women being mutilated for, like, the most, well, from our cultural perspective, unreasonable, but
Yeah.
it just reinforces these ideas.
Yeah, I think that there's that sense of, like, one of my colleagues was talking about a film recently and said, it's incredible the way rape has become shorthand for, very, very bad character. That's all you need. You just need some suggestion of, like, some images of sexual violence, and now we understand who's wicked and who's not, and it's used in a way to kind of reinforce sort of ideas, like you say, about helplessness, about gender helplessness, and who's vulnerable and who isn't.
But at the same time, like you mentioned, reasons, like you said, if for example, those people leave and people will go back into ways of, like, treating women badly, and that's their reason to stay in those countries. There's also media, from what I see, has been showing that, because we have arrived, women are becoming more empowered, like, more women are coming out and, like, standing up for themselves and things like that, and, like, it's, I don't know, I feel like over time things might, I don't know, change, but, like, I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's about, as
Intervention or...
Yeah. I mean, as well, to sort of go back to what Brandon was saying about colonisation. I mean, again, it's a sort of an imposition of a judgment by a particular set of cultural and social norms. And I don't sort of support the idea of relativism, where we have no, we can't say anything because we mustn't be, we mustn't impose our own set of cultural understandings. I don't think that that's reasonable either. But I think that there is a sense in which we judge progress in terms of the rights of women very much from a Western perspective, without recognising other alternatives and other ways of being, and other ways of being empowered, in fact. As you were saying about the unarmed police officer, that she potentially has power, and if she has agency, she has power to affect situations in a different way, do things differently. So I think it's a complicated.
And from our perspective, we define power as if women are able to hold the gun or whatever and things like that, but is that really what the power we want to be defined as? Things like that. Maybe we should question.
I guess for me, it's not so much an issue of whether women are in the public space or not, or how they're used in the public space, but that the public space itself is defined by this patriarchy and allows these narratives to take shape in ways that are obviously conducive to the type of result they want. So in one situation, she's flirting, she wants it, and that's the comment that you bring up for the society that you started off with. That statistic is very stark, right? But you put that in contrast to how the entertainment industry is now utilizing rape as a form of, defining good versus evil. So the maiden will always have some kind of hero to protect that innocence, and anyone else clearly is defined elsewhere, And that's obviously to me, instrumental of men still being permitted to define that space, to say, well, if I can't protect you, then obviously you weren't worth protecting. And that is kind of, I think, I don't know, that interpersonal relationship is somewhat lost. And then in these stories, I understand that you're probably bringing out only pieces of it, right? But that is maybe the only piece people will walk away with, rather than identifying with any women or their stories, or even hearing their stories, or potentially hearing their stories. And so I don't know that any of this is really challenging the public space enough to permit a true feminist dialogue in it. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting question, because the more I look at representations of sexual violence in my area is drama, of course, so I'm looking at the theatre and fictional representations, but I think that fictional representations are significant for what they tell us about what's happening in the society, what the concerns of the society are, and also because the way that we understand and interpret them necessarily has to do with what we're, what our cultural surroundings, our baggage, and what we're bringing to it. And I think one of the things that I found kind of challenging about work, I suppose, and interesting about it, is that the more you sort of explore the dramatic representation, the more it seems to reveal about a whole set of kind of assumptions that we don't even perhaps consciously have about, how do we recognise that the heroine has been attacked? Well, her hair is dishevelled, just the same way that we recognise that she's not a nice girl, that her, she hasn't got her hair combed to another scarf. There's all sorts of ways in which we understand costume, for example, dialogue, the social behaviour as well, that I think that are very much shaped by, as you say, by those patriarchal structures that we are all, within, sort of interpolated into. And I do find that's one of the things about the work. So plays like Abby Spalding's Hunt Girl, I think it's quite an interesting piece of work. I wouldn't suggest that a piece of theatre can change the world or even an individual person. But one of the things I find interesting about it is that actually the description of rape within it, or the circumstances of the rape within it, are almost parallel those of the most common forms of rape. That is, she's with somebody she knows, she's with someone she trusts, it's her partner, there's alcohol involved, he's slightly older than her, he's a slightly higher social status, they're both young. The work done by Hanley and others on legal work on rape in Ireland identifies more or less exactly this kind of scenario. They go consensually, she goes with him consensually, and then this violence erupts. There isn't a weapon used. She's not kind of physically harmed in the sense that the force used is relatively minimal because she's almost unconscious anyway. And as Hanley and the others conclude, that kind of rape is very rarely prosecuted, it's often not reported to the police, and the chances of conviction are minimal. So it's kind of, the research is kind of interesting because I end up reading legal texts as well, and a whole lot of sociological texts that are really outside of my own subject area.